sorry. Sure. Minister, please go ahead. Good morning. I'm here with Minister of Energy Sonia Savage and Minister of Environment and Parks Jason Nixon for some important announcements about Alberta's response to the economic crisis created by the coronavirus pandemic. We know that, as I've said before, Alberta is dealing with a triple threat. First of all, the pandemic itself. Secondly, the massive economic impact, the worldwide recession that it's created. And thirdly, the crisis in our largest industry, our oil and gas sector. I see that Western Canadian Select crude oil is trading right now at $2.80. And as we know, it has been in negative price territory together with West Texas Intermediate, the key benchmark, over the past week. All of this further underscoring the depth of economic adversity that Albertans are facing. Our government has responded with unprecedented action, so far totaling over $14 billion in fiscal action to help to protect families and job creators to get through this time of crisis. Over $14 billion, including investments in additional, of course, support for our healthcare system, for mental health, the emergency isolation payments, deferrals on taxes and fees and student loans, support for food banks and homeless shelters, and so much more. Additional liquidity measures totaling about $6 billion being delivered by Alberta Treasury branches, and much more action, and much more to follow. We continue to meet on a regular basis with the Economic Recovery Council, chaired by Dr. Jack Mintz, where we have some of Alberta's brightest minds helping to develop our strategy for economic recovery. One key element of which has been our historic investment in getting a major pipeline built and creating good, high-paying jobs through the Keystone XL pipeline, that $1.5 billion equity investment and the loan guarantee next year, which I'm pleased to report now has shovels in the ground here in Alberta, as well as in Saskatchewan and parts of the United States. Construction is well underway, and one of the reasons we made that historic investment was to get work moving now in this construction season and throughout 2020 to create facts on the ground. And I'm just delighted to see that we have now seen TC Energy actually install the pipe across the Canada-US border between Saskatchewan and Montana. This investment will create, we estimate, 7,000 jobs directly and indirectly here in Alberta this year alone. And it takes us towards projected completion of Keystone XL in the summer or spring of 2023, adding at least 830,000 barrels a day of additional shipment capacity for Alberta Energy, and we believe that Alberta's government will receive back at least $30 billion in additional royalties and other revenues because of the additional shipments that Keystone XL will make possible. Secondly, I'm here today with Minister Savage to announce our $1 billion well site rehabilitation program that we estimate will create at least 5,300 good-paying jobs here in Alberta this year. We will be launching the well site rehabilitation program on May the 1st, a week from now. And we will be moving as quickly as we possibly can to turn that money into jobs in communities all across Alberta, and particularly helping to put back to work great oilfield service workers who have been laid off, and throwing a critical lifeline to the service sector, those small companies and contractors up and down this province, who in many areas are the lifeblood of the economy of rural Alberta. And we once again want to thank the Government of Canada for becoming a partner with Alberta's government in this critical project. That $1 billion coming from the announcement made a week ago today by the national government. This is in addition to the Government of Alberta and the Government of Canada investing $300 million additionally between us into the Alberta Orphan Well Association, which will be running its own program. Minister Savage, in a couple of minutes, will present the details of the rapid rollout of this job-creating $1 billion well site rehabilitation program. Minister Nixon will also be presenting the work that he and his department are making on implementing the $500 million federal support for key investments that will create jobs and reduce methane emissions in the Alberta oil and gas sector. This is going to as well be great support for the service sector right across the province. And Minister Nixon is also making further progress on delaying the implementation, we hope, of the federal clean fuel standards to avoid imposing yet another cost on an already struggling industry. And I believe he's making great progress as well with the Government of Canada on getting an equivalency agreement with respect to new methane regulations, again, to reduce the burden on Alberta businesses at a critical time. Thirdly, I'm pleased to announce that Alberta's government will partner with the Government of Canada in two important new cost-share programs. The first is the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program that was announced last week. We are still waiting for further details from the federal government, but Alberta is prepared to invest up to $67.2 million, which would be the maximum for our province, matched with $267 million from the Government of Canada for $334 million in emergency support for commercial tenants. This program will provide a loan retroactive to April the 1st, 2020 to qualified commercial property owners, supporting up to 50% of rent for April, May, and June of this year. And the loan will be forgivable if the property owner and tenant come to a rent forgiveness agreement that lowers the eligible business's rent by 75% for the 3 months and includes a moratorium on eviction. And the program is anticipated to be running by mid-May and will be administered by the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Qualifying small businesses will be required to pay they will be required to participate. They must pay less than $50,000 in rent. So this is not for huge businesses, but small and medium-sized businesses. And they have to have been asked to close or nearly close their operations due to public health orders around COVID-19. And they must be experiencing at least a 70% decrease in revenue. So basically, this is for small and medium-sized businesses that have been heavily impacted by the pandemic. The program will also be available to nonprofit and charitable organizations, and more details will follow. So that is a confirmation that the Government of Alberta will be participating in that cost-share program, and I'll be conveying that to the Prime Minister when I speak with him later today during the First Minister's teleconference. We'll also be participating in the temporary salary top-up for low-income essential workers, another joint cost-share program that was recently announced. This is focused on essential service workers in certain industries who make less than $2,500 a month. It's a federal provincial cost share program, and we will use this to help with the recently announced Alberta $2 top-up for healthcare aides working in continuing care facilities. That was part of the announcement made by Minister Shandro earlier this week to alleviate the labor challenges being faced by our long-term care facilities. We know that those places are uniquely vulnerable to the pandemic, and because we have instituted a new rule limiting healthcare aides to working to only one continuing care facility, that's created some very significant labor challenges, and we don't want our seniors in those facilities to not have adequate support. That's why we've brought in the Alberta wage top-up for healthcare aides in long-term care settings, and with our participation in this federal provincial cost share program will help us get that done. Finally, I want to talk about the ongoing conversations that we are having with key policymakers in the United States about the need for a coordinated North American continental approach to energy. Given the predatory dumping of energy on global markets by OPEC Plus over the past several weeks, that is one of the reasons we are in this catastrophic situation with global and Canadian inventories for oil reaching tank tops. That's why we're now facing $2 or $3 WCS prices this week. Minister Savage and I have spent an enormous amount of time in recent weeks during the crisis meeting with key decision makers in the United States, from the U.S. Secretary of Energy, the Undersecretary of Energy, undersecretaries at the Department of State. I've spoken to over a dozen members of the United States Senate and many more members of the House of Representatives, members of the Senate and House committees on energy, as well as many governors across the United States. Minister Savage has also had an ongoing dialogue, not only with OPEC, but also with the Texas Railroad Commission, which is the largest regulator of oil production in the United States. And she can provide more information, but I'm glad to see that the Texas Railroad Commission has indicated an openness to some kind of coordinated approach to help ensure the future of North American energy. But all of these conversations we've been having with the U.S. administration, Congress, and state governments underscore the central importance of Alberta's relationship with the United States. And that is more important now than ever. We export over $100 billion of goods to the U.S. every year. Nearly 90% of Alberta's global exports go to one country, the United States. And it is more important now than ever that we have a strong voice representing Alberta's vital economic interests in Washington, D.C. And that's why I'm pleased to announce today the appointment of former Member of Parliament and former Chair of the House of Commons Finance Committee, James Rajat, to be Alberta's representative at our office in Washington, D.C. Alberta has had a office co-located with the Canadian Embassy in Washington for, I think, some 25 years, and a number of distinguished people who have represented us in Washington. James is going to be a phenomenal representative. He is an Edmonton born and raised parliamentarian of 15 years. For the past several years, he's been working as a senior executive in the telecommunications industry. James has bachelor and master's degrees from the University of Alberta, and he chaired the House of Commons Finance Committee during the global financial crisis. He represented Edmonton in the House of Commons for 15 years, and I believe was chair of the House of Commons Finance Committee for 7 of those years. As well, he served as chair of the House of Commons Industry Committee. And during all of that time, maintained very close relationships with key congressional leaders and other political leaders in Washington and across the United States. He served as vice chair of the Canada-United States Interparliamentary Group, which brings together Canadian and U.S. parliamentarians. And so he already has a very deep network in Washington that he can put to work for us right away. James developed a great reputation during his decade and a half in Parliament as somebody who works across party lines. And it's important in dealing with Congress to actually have somebody who understands the political world, who can relate to congressmen, senators, governors, and members of the administration. So I want to thank James for stepping forward and making the sacrifice for public service. He's going to be a tremendous voice for us in Washington, and his term will begin on May the 1st. With that, I will hand it over to Energy Minister Sonia Savage.
Well, thank you, Premier. And before I share the details of the Site Rehabilitation Program, I want to reiterate the Premier's words about what we're undertaking across North America. So very soon after this crisis began, the Premier and myself started reaching out to some of our counterparts in the U.S., including the Texas Railroad Commission. As we've moved forward through this crisis, I've continued to stay in regular contact with the Commission, sharing information and having discussions about North American energy security. And I also continue to stay in regular contact with the Secretary General of OPEC. Now, Texas, similar to Alberta, has an energy industry that is integral to their entire economy. This is, as the Premier noted, the U.S. is our largest trading partner and the largest buyers of crude oil. We send over 3.8 million barrels a day south to the United States. So it's immensely important that we continue to coordinate with officials in the United States, and this is to ensure that Alberta's interests are represented and protected. As Premier noted, storage levels across North America are quickly nearing tank top. This has been reflected in the volatility that we've seen in the market this past week. And as we move forward, we need to find solutions in a coordinated fashion. So that's why we're having these continued conversations at the North American level, and we'll continue to do that to protect Alberta's energy sector. And that's because how Alberta and Canada come through this economic crisis depends upon the survival and success of our energy sector. It's our economy's largest subsector and largest job creator, creating over 800,000 jobs across the Canadian economy. And this is why we're launching today the Site Rehabilitation Program. It's to create jobs and to immediately get Albertans back to work. We can do this while addressing important cleanup activities in our province. The $1 billion program will provide grants to Alberta oilfield service companies that perform well, pipeline, and oil and gas closure and reclamation work. This work will be done in Alberta, putting Albertans back to work. The funding from this program will go directly to where it is needed most, to Alberta's skilled oilfield service contractors that are doing the site closure work. These are contractors that, due to the current economic conditions now and in the past 5 years, either have limited access to work or now they have no access to work. So this program will create much needed jobs. We anticipate that it will create 5,300 jobs and lead to the cleanup of thousands of environmental sites. The funding will ensure that Albertans can go to work and that our energy sector is supported as we begin to recover from the effects of COVID-19. The economic benefits of this program include direct and indirect employment. It'll help various sectors all across economies, Alberta's economy, like restaurants, hotel workers, building supply stores, many other businesses across the regions in the province that are most hard hit by this economic crisis. As we developed this program, our focus was to create a system that could be implemented immediately. These jobs are needed now. We need to get Albertans back to work. Well, first and foremost, the program is about creating jobs. It also reinforces our commitment to responsible resource development. And as the program proceeds, oil and gas companies who are financially able to pay for a portion of the cleanup will do so. On May 1st, in 1 week, we will launch our first round for an initial $100 million, with a focus on providing grants to service companies that have been the hardest hit by the economic downturn. In the coming weeks after that, we will allocate future increments for work in specific regions across the province, directing funds to where they can have the most significant environmental benefits, or where some operators have failed landowners and have not paid their lease rents. In future rounds, we will also focus on larger projects. During these rapidly changing times, we also recognize the need to be fluid. That's why we're opening the funding allocations in increments. This will allow us to learn and adapt as we go along, to make adjustments and to maximize job creation. So starting on May 1st, oilfield service companies will be able to apply for a grant on a new online portal at alberta.ca. Their project eligibility, application, and work contract will be verified, and once approved, grants will be dispersed. We anticipate that this work and payments will start on May 1st. We need to make sure that Alberta is prepared and ready to recover once the COVID crisis passes, and we know we need to recover the energy sector in Alberta. Our Site Rehabilitation Program will immediately save and create thousands of jobs, keeping energy service companies going until we can turn the corner and relaunch our economy, all while meeting Alberta's commitment to responsible resource development. Thank you so much, and I'll turn the floor over to Minister Nixon.
Well, thank you, Minister Savage. In addition to the $1.1 billion that Minister Savage was speaking about in the announcement that came from the federal government on Friday, the federal government also announced that they would be bringing in $750 million in loans for methane reduction, loans to energy companies across the country, of which $675 million will be designated for onshore, of which Alberta has over 2/3 of those emissions. So it's a significant amount of money that will be invested inside our oil and gas service sectors to deal with methane going forward. We do appreciate, as the Premier said, that federal investment. We also appreciate that the recognition by the federal government with that direction on loans going directly to companies, that they are recognizing that the Alberta energy industry, our oil and gas industry, are leaders in methane reduction technology and are best positioned to be able to reduce methane emissions here in Alberta and ultimately to help our provincial partners across the country going forward. In Alberta, we've been successful already over the last several years in reducing our methane emissions by 20%, and we expect that we'll be able to continue. This also fits very nicely with the general direction that we've been taking on emissions overall in the province of Alberta, with the introduction of our Technology, Innovation and Emission Reduction Program, which focuses on empowering our energy industry to use their unique abilities and technologies to be able to tackle emissions. This fits great when it comes to methane, and we will be working in the coming days to make adjustments to TIER and our funding plans for methane emission reduction across the province in the coming days that we think will dovetail very nicely with the federal announcement and will continue to be able to help us, just like we're doing with abandoned wells, tackling an environmental objective while putting our oil and gas service sector to work. We'll be excited to talk more about that in the coming weeks, and with that I think we're happy to take questions.
Okay, I'll just let everyone on the phone know that we only have a short time for questions. So, operator, can you please put through the first caller?
Yes, the first question is from Chris Varco, Calgary Herald. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this is a question I think is to Minister Nixon or Minister Savage. Can you explain how this program is going to work in the sense that will companies be required to contribute some money for the cleanup? And secondly, with the polluter pay principle, how is it that the money is going to be going to the service companies when the responsibility for the well cleanup is primarily to the E&P companies?
Sure, and thank you, Chris, for the question. First and foremost, this program is about job creation. It's about getting Albertans back to work and getting them back to work quickly. It also has the added benefit of cleaning up some environmental liabilities. With respect to companies' contributions to it, we're looking at a graduated program where some of the well reclamation will get 100% of the costs paid for by the program. Some will be 50% and some 25%. And that's going to be based on a company's financial ability to pay. One thing we know for sure is there's companies out there that have been hit hard over the last 5 years, and they are devastated by the demand destruction and the price destruction from COVID. They don't have 2 pennies to rub together to put any contribution forward to cleaning up their inactive wells, and they're just going to tip over those wells into the orphan wells funds. So it's those companies that will need to have 100% of the cost paid for by the program. It's those same companies that are behind on landowner lease payments. Landowners aren't being paid, and the Alberta Surface Rights Board, the Alberta government's making those payments. So some of them will have 100% of the costs paid for, others will be contributing. But you have to remember this program is about job creation and cleaning up environmental liabilities.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Emma Grady, Globe and Mail.
G'day, everybody. Yeah, just a quick follow-up there that's also related to Chris's question and then something a little separate. So can landowners who are not being paid by oil and gas companies, could they potentially reach out to contractors here and say, there's an inactive well on my land, we're not getting paid, can you apply for this money? And just secondly, Premier, could you just explain a little bit more about what Mr. Rajot's role is going to be in DC and why that decision was made now to put him down there?
Thank you, Emma. And with regard to the first question, the answer is yes. There's going to be a landowner opt-in to prioritize sites and well sites where the landowner wants the site cleaned up and reclaimed. So there'll be a prioritization of those sites. There's something like 94,000 well sites, inactive well sites in Alberta. that can qualify for this, and the priority will go to well sites where landowners have prioritized and said they want it cleaned up.
Thanks, Emma. So James will be Alberta's senior representative in Washington, running our office there, which we've had co-located at the Canadian Embassy for at least 25 years. The reason we're making this announcement now is that the position has been vacant for the last 2 or 3 months. Our acting representative, Liam Stone, came back here to Edmonton to become an assistant deputy minister at the Policy Coordination Office in the Executive Council. And so we had a search process for a new senior representative of Alberta in Washington. And James had to take some time to wrap up his affairs at his current company where he works, where he's a senior vice president at Rogers Telecommunications. And he will be getting in that position on May the 1st. We also, we had some delays on this just because of the pandemic, being able to move somebody down there and sorting out all of the quarantine protocols in Washington. But he will begin effectively in that position next week, and I'm very excited about this. If you talk to former colleagues of James in in Ottawa, they'll tell you that he was somebody really renowned for working across party lines and getting things done as a very effective senior parliamentarian. So he will be our primary interface with the U.S. Congress and the administration. Obviously, we work very closely with the Canadian Embassy, and I want to thank our new ambassador, who has been recently confirmed, the ambassador grew up actually in Lethbridge, and so she understands Alberta very well. She's been a strong voice as well for our energy sector. One of the primary mandates that James will have in the post will be to amplify the discussion we're having about a coordinated North American energy strategy. We want to make sure that, as you know, sometimes in the United States, they take Canada and Alberta for granted, and as we are facing a common threat to the viability of our important North American oil and gas industry that is totally integrated. And American energy security and independence is dependent on the continued vitality of the Canadian energy sector. So part of James' job will be to make sure that Keystone XL gets done, to continue to communicate on the importance of that as the U.S. goes through their election cycle, to liaise with governors and regulators along the pipeline route, to work with TC Energy on that project, to help to maintain our growing linkages into the United States Department of Energy, for example, to make sure that American policy makers understand how important Canadian energy is to the U.S. economy. So those will be some of the initial challenges that James is facing. Of course, agriculture and other exports will also be on his part of his work plan.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Tom Ross, 660 News.
Hi. With the oil and gas market taking such a hit, when do you start thinking about a full-on transition away from traditional fossil fuels? And when you're talking to American representatives, for example, are you talking to anybody who advocates for a Green New Deal?
So, as Minister Nixon has said, Alberta has our Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Program, which invests in technology to reduce the environmental impact and carbon intensity of our energy production. When you talk about the Green New Deal, listen, our focus is on getting people back to work in Alberta, not pie-in-the-sky ideological schemes. We are actually not trying to amplify, but to fight back against the political agenda of the Green left that has been trying to landlock Alberta energy. So we're not going to cooperate with the folks that are trying to shut down Canada's single largest subsector. You're talking here, that kind of question in the middle of an economic crisis from a Calgary-based media outlet really, frankly, throws me for a loop. Sounds like you're reporting for the Tyee or something. Here's the reality. Canada's oil and gas sector employs directly and indirectly 500,000 Canadians, has paid $380 billion to governments over the past 18 years, is by far our largest export industry. And Canada has the third largest proven and probable oil reserves on Earth. We are the fourth largest producer and one of the largest natural gas producers. Even in the most bearish scenario for oil consumption, produced by the International Energy Agency, they see at least 70 million barrels per day of oil consumption in 2040, 2 decades from now. That would be down by only 30% from the average over the past few years. And in that world, 20 years from now, when the world needs that energy, we want to make sure that it's coming from a stable, environmentally responsible, market-based democracy with the world's highest human rights, labor, and environmental standards. That would be Alberta. So, no, we're not going to work with congressmen, the small minority in Congress that wants to pursue the ideological fantasy of shutting down the modern industrial economy. We will continue to support technology that helps us to perform better on an environmental point of view and tell our tremendous story about our environmental, social, and governance performance. But in that world, 20 years from now, when at least 70 million barrels of oil is being produced and consumed, we will be a major part of that supply. We will not abandon global energy markets to some of the world's worst regimes.
Operator, can you please put through the next call?
Christine, I have to run for a call with the Prime Minister and the other premiers, but I'm going to ask the ministers to stay here and take additional questions. Thanks very much.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Yes, thank you. Alana Smith, Post Media. Please go ahead.
So sorry, I was just logging out. My question was for Premier Kenney, so go ahead to the next one. Thanks.
Sorry, Alana. Operator, can you put through the next caller, please?
Yes, Jeffrey Morgan, Financial Post. Please go ahead.
Hi, this question is for Minister Savage. Minister, as you're announcing the program today for well remediation, there are many who had expected at this point to have new regulations in place. You'd spoken previously about removing things like the LMR, LLR with new systems. Can you tell us when the new regulation scheme or regulation systems will be in place, when they'll be announced, and if there is any connection between this funding coming in from the federal government and a new system being introduced by the Alberta government? Is there a requirement there that a new system is put in place?
Sure. Thank you for that question. And as you know and most know, we were working on a liability management package that would cover a policy suite that would cover the life cycle of a well, from the entire life cycle, from well licensee application to operation to abandonment, reclamation, and to post-legacy. Then COVID-19 hit. We were in the worst demand destruction of oil, the worst price environment of oil. We still have 94,000 inactive wells to clean up. So yes, we are moving forward with the full suite of policies for a liability management framework, but right now the priority is getting some Albertans back to work, getting some of the existing legacy sites cleaned up. We've got program work, $1 billion on it, plus $300 million additional in the Orphan Well Association. And right now, while we're in the present crisis and emergency, that's the focus. Ongoing discussions with the federal government. We have, and as you know, we are improving the liability management process and moving forward in the future with a suite of policies so that these wells, when they're finished and they're beyond their useful production life, will be abandoned and reclaimed in an orderly manner. And we are still proceeding with that, but more to come after we get through the immediate crisis.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Dan Healing, Canadian Press.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. I have a quick question. It says that the program is mainly being funded by the federal government's economic response plan. What does that mean? How much of it is coming from the province? And also, I'm wondering who's going to administer the plan And realistically, if people aren't applying for it until May 1st, when would the funds actually be flowing out?
Sure. Yes, the funds are coming from the federal announcement last Friday for $1 billion for a fund to clean up the inactive wells. It's being administered by the Alberta government through the Department of Energy, and the program, the full online portal to accept applications will be opening up on May 1st. So within the announcement from the federal government, there will be a coordinating committee between federal and provincial officials to ensure that the program is being administered properly, that it's transparent, that it's achieving its objectives. So there'll be regular correspondence and work with the federal government on ensuring that the program is meeting its objectives. So, and in terms of when we expect it to get going, ASAP, we would expect companies to be bringing forward nearly ready-to-go contracts starting May 1st. There'll be a very quick review process, verification and review process, and in a lot of cases, we can expect that work to start immediately. We will, on properly executed contracts between the service provider and the well licensee, will come forward. We'll have a contract with the government put in place before they receive the funds. They'll receive 10% up front as an initial start. As they complete the work, they'll be eligible for up to 60% of the invoices as they go along, with the balance due upon completion of the work. So we expect to get people in the field in May.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Kevin Orland, Bloomberg News.
Hello. I was wondering if you still expect or are working on any additional support measures for the industry with the federal government. Seems like most of the programs so far that have come out have been to support sort of smaller or mid-sized. And I wonder if there's anything in the works for some of the larger companies in the industry.
Sure. We continue to work with the federal government. A lot of the work is coming through the Federal Department of Finance. Our Department of Finance and Energy, our deputy ministers and myself and Minister Taves and the Premier's office, all of us are working with the federal government to ensure that the liquidity package comes forward, that it's understood, that it is sufficient. We're still working. The details aren't fully there. They rolled out some details last week with the Business Development BDC and the EDC. We're still analyzing how those programs might work, whether they're sufficient and where there might be gaps. Once we know that and where there might be gaps, we'll take a look as a province on whether there's some additional measures we need to do to step up. As you know, we've already launched a number of measures for immediate operational liquidity for some of these companies, things like deferral or cancellation of workers' compensation board fees, AER fees, corporate taxes, some property taxes, any sort of fee that we can find to ensure that there's immediate liquidity for some of the companies, but we know there needs to be more, and we're waiting for the details of the federal program.
We have time for 3 more questions. Operator, can you put through the next caller, please?
Graham Thompson, iPolitics.
Hello, this is a question, I guess, for either minister, but it's a change in topic. I was wondering if you explain the order in council that was approved this week, giving the government power to borrow up to $25 billion. Is there anything planned for that money?
Graham, we have to operate the government. The reality is that we are facing a new fiscal situation. Mr. Taves and the Premier and all of Alberta's government has spoken about that. We are looking at a period of time where we're going to see a bigger deficit than anticipated, and of course, we're going to need access to more cash to be able to operate Alberta's government and to provide the services that Albertans rely on. And with that, I'd refer you to Mr. Taves for more details specifically on how that would work.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Mike D'Souza, Global National.
Yes, thanks for taking the question. To either minister, I was wondering if either of you would be able to explain the government's thinking behind the cabinet decision to lift the pause on consultations that companies are required to do with Indigenous communities on resource projects. And if you could also explain, when you made that decision, what factors led you to believe these sorts of consultations can be done safely in a way that avoids the spread of COVID-19, particularly if they require involvement of elders in some of the Treaty 8 nations that may not have easy access to internet or video conferencing.
So that order in council was done under the advice of Indigenous Affairs Minister Rick Wilson, and my understanding, and I'm sure he'll be happy to speak to it more if you contact his office, as it was done after a request from First Nation communities across the province to be able to provide some delays to the process, to be able to then be able to put in place processes that can help with COVID-19 consultation. We continue to need to move forward with projects to be able to keep the economy going, obviously, and so consultation is an important part of that. But I know Minister Wilson is working tirelessly with his team to be able to make sure that we are able to accommodate First Nation communities, and you are correct. Some of our First Nation communities don't have access to the same level of internet as other places of the province. And so he has to come up with creative ways to deal with that issue, but he is dealing with it. And again, I'd refer you to him for more information on that.
Operator, can you please put through the last caller?
Thank you. Chris Epp, CTV Calgary.
Thank you. This was for the Premier, but I'm sure either of you could answer this. I'll sort of wrap two questions into one. First of all, the small business rent subsidy, I believe he said, was retroactive to April 1, but I know several businesses in Calgary, restaurants specifically, that have already been evicted or say they can't make their rent for April, so they've started to move out. So I'm wondering if this is too late for them. Also, what efforts are being made as far as subsidizing rent for tenants, just renters, not business? Thank you.
I'm not sure on the timeline on the first question. You stumped me on that, so I don't want to speak to it and get it wrong. I'd refer you to Minister Glubish, Minister of Service Alberta, who would probably be better off or better able to answer that for you. We continue to work on many aspects of our economy where we're trying to help our Albertans as we go through COVID-19 together. Specifically to rent, we've seen some announcements from Service Alberta, and I think also announcements for community and social services and other departments that are working to help people through these tough times. And I would refer you again to those ministers who can go in much more greater detail than Minister Savage or I can on their programs, and I think that's probably a more effective way to answer that question.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks, everyone.